So, all this news about the U.S. president and this potential standoff, right, over that court order dealing with foreign aid, it really makes you think about some pretty fundamental stuff about how a democracy actually works. How does it make sure that the judiciary, the courts, can actually get their rulings, their decisions enforced and heard? You
Hmm.
know, this whole tension, right, between the different branches of government, it's like
Yeah.
a core part of how these systems function.
Yeah, it is. This is a critical moment, and as you mentioned, not just for the US, any system that's designed to, divide power like this needs ways to make sure that nobody gets too much
Yeah.
power, that no single branch is just running unchecked. And like when the executive, the president, even suggests that they might not follow a court order, it forces everyone to look closely at those mechanisms, those things that are supposed to, like, uphold the rule of law.
And for our listeners out there, especially those of you who are preparing for the UPSC exams, this isn't just some random news story from across the world. This situation in the U.S., that's like a really great example to help us understand this big principle of separation of powers. It shows us how different democracies actually make sure that judges' orders are carried out. Think about it. This relates directly to constitutional frameworks, governance, the stuff that's super important for both mains and prelims.
Exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. When you compare how different countries deal with this kind of problem, you get a much better understanding of your own political system. It's not about just memorizing articles and clauses, it's about grasping those real-world dynamics when different parts of the government are interacting, sometimes clashing.
So that's what we're going to dig into today. Really unpack how courts in both the U.S. and India actually enforce their rulings, especially when there's a chance that the executive branch might, let's just say, resist a little. And we're going to be using some really insightful reporting to help us paint a clearer picture. We're looking at a piece from the Indian Express today. It offers a very, clear comparative analysis.
Yeah, and just to give you all a roadmap of where we're headed in this deep dive, we'll start with the structure of the courts, both in the US and India, and talk about how far their authority extends their jurisdiction. And then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of their contempt powers, what they are, how they're different, and what those differences actually mean in practice. And then we'll wrap things up by looking at the mechanisms that ensure compliance with court orders. We'll talk about concepts like sovereign immunity and the very important role that judicial review plays in all of this.
Okay, so let's break this down. Let's start with the basics. How are the courts actually structured? Both the U.S. and India have a three-tiered system, right? So you have your trial courts, then courts for appeals, and finally the top dog, the Supreme Court.
Exactly. In the U.S., at the bottom level, you have the district courts. They're responsible for those initial trials, both civil and criminal cases. An interesting thing about these courts is that the judges have life tenure, which means they serve for life. And this gives them, quite a bit of independence. Above the district courts are the circuit courts. These are the appellate courts, and they typically review cases with a panel of 3 judges. Then right at the top is the U.S. Supreme Court, the final court of appeal. They don't have to hear every case, they get to choose. It's what's called discretionary jurisdiction. And they mainly focus on issues that have to do with the U.S. Constitution and federal law. And when we talk about them choosing cases, it's often through these things called writs of certiorari. It's basically like an order telling a lower court to send up the records of a case so the Supreme Court can review it.
Okay, so that's the U.S. system. What about here in India? How does it compare?
India has a very similar structure, a 3-level setup. So we have the district courts at the base, then high courts at the state level, and of course the Supreme Court of India, which is the highest court in the land. But here's where it gets really interesting when we start talking about the kinds of cases they can handle. U.S. federal courts deal with cases allowed by their constitution or federal laws. But in India, the courts have a broader scope. They handle cases that fall under the constitution, but also cases under the IPC, which is now the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, and the CRPC, now known as the Bharatiya Nagarik Suraksha Sanhita, basically India's main criminal laws, and they also handle cases under different state laws.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, the Indian courts have a wider reach, right? They can handle a greater variety of cases.
That's exactly right. And the Supreme Court of India, it really has a more extensive jurisdiction compared to the U.S. Supreme Court. For example, Article 131 of the Indian Constitution says that the Supreme Court has the sole authority to handle disputes between the union government and the states, or even between different states. Think about it. This power, this exclusive original jurisdiction, is huge. It makes the Indian Supreme Court the main referee for any federal disagreements. It can potentially prevent the kind of long, drawn-out political fights that you might see in the U.S., where those kinds of disputes might have to go through different courts before reaching the Supreme Court.
I see. So that's a pretty significant power. Are there other examples where the Indian Supreme Court's jurisdiction is unique or different?
Absolutely. Take Article 143, for example. It lets the President of India ask the Supreme Court for advice, for their opinion, on any important legal question or fact that has implications for the public. This advisory jurisdiction is interesting. It doesn't exist in the U.S. system. It lets the executive branch, the president, and their people get legal guidance from the highest court, even if it's not directly related to a case they're involved in.
That's a pretty powerful tool for the executive branch.
Hmm.
So apart from these specific articles in the Constitution, are there other things that make the Indian Supreme Court's authority different?
Yeah, there are. The Indian Supreme Court has more power when it comes to hearing appeals, and its ability to review the validity of laws and actions taken by the executive, what we call judicial review. That's much more extensive. And then there's public interest litigation, or PIL. It's a big difference. PIL lets individuals or groups go directly to the Supreme Court on behalf of the public, even if their own rights haven't been directly violated. This has made the Indian Supreme Court more accessible to ordinary people, more influential in their daily lives compared to the U.S. Supreme Court.
All right, so that's a good understanding of how these courts are set up and the kinds of cases they handle.
Yeah.
But let's move to a really important topic, especially given what's going on right now. Let's talk about contempt powers, the power to actually enforce their authority. We hear this term all the time, but what does it actually mean in the U.S. and India?
Yeah. At its core, contempt of court is a way for the courts to protect their authority and integrity. It's about shielding themselves from attacks, criticisms that undermine public trust in the courts, and really importantly, it's about punishing anyone who tries to stop them from working effectively, for instance, by refusing to follow a court order.
And I understand there are generally two types of contempt, right? Both in the U.S. and India.
Right. In the U.S. system, you have civil contempt. This usually happens when someone doesn't comply with a court order. The key thing here is that it's often considered remedial, meaning if the person or entity starts following the order, that contempt finding can be reversed. And then there's criminal contempt, which is a much bigger deal. This involves things that obstruct justice or show blatant disregard for the court's authority. It's interesting to note, a sitting U.S. president has never actually been held in contempt of court. And on top of that, in the U.S., the president can actually pardon someone for criminal contempt. So when you think about it, there's no precedent for holding a U.S. president in contempt, and there's always the possibility of a pardon. That makes it a lot harder to hold the U.S. executive branch directly accountable to court orders compared to India.
Okay, so that's how the U.S. distinguishes between those two types. What about India? How do they define civil and criminal contempt?
India is pretty similar. They also have civil contempt, which is essentially the willful disobedience of a court order. And they have criminal contempt, which covers actions that undermine the court's authority in the eyes of the public, scandalizing the court or anything that obstructs the delivery of justice.
Earlier, you mentioned how contempt proceedings can be initiated, how these cases get started. Are there differences between the two countries in how this happens?
Definitely. In the U.S., it's usually one of the parties involved in the case that starts the contempt proceedings, or sometimes the court itself. But in India, the courts have much broader power. They can initiate these proceedings on their own, what's called suo motu, if they think their authority has been challenged. Also, an individual can actually petition the court to start these proceedings, but usually they need to get the okay from the Attorney General of India first.
Interesting. So in India, there's that extra step involving the Attorney General for individual petitions. What about the legal basis for these contempt powers? Where does the authority for contempt come from in each country?
In the U.S., the Judiciary Act of 1789 is like the foundation. It gives all federal courts the power to issue orders, the legal stuff they need to do, and it gives them the power to enforce those orders through contempt and other sanctions. In India, though, this authority comes straight from the Constitution. Article 129 specifically gives the Supreme Court the power to punish for contempt of itself. And Article 215 gives those same powers to the high courts, including the power to punish for contempt of lower courts that fall under their authority. But it's not just the Constitution. India also has the Contempt of Courts Act of 1971. This act gives a really detailed framework. It defines what exactly contempt is and how it can be punished in India.
Okay, good to know. Are there any other key differences or nuances we should keep in mind when we're comparing these contempt powers?
There's one important difference in India. There's a specific exception made for fair and accurate comments on a case after it's already been decided. It basically acknowledges that public discussion and critique of court decisions is important in a democracy, even while upholding the authority of the courts.
Makes sense. So we've covered the structure of the courts, what kinds of cases they handle, and the powers they have to enforce their orders through contempt. But what about when someone actually disobeys a court order? What happens then? What are the mechanisms for dealing with noncompliance, and what kind of penalties can be imposed? I think this takes us to the concept of sovereign immunity, right? It's kind of like the government having a legal shield to protect itself from some actions.
Yeah, exactly. In the U.S. system, judges generally prefer to negotiate, to work things out, and to adjust their demands to ensure compliance. And part of the reason for this preference is the very strong doctrine of sovereign immunity in the U.S. Basically, sovereign immunity means you can't sue the government unless they say you can. This puts limits on the types of penalties that can be imposed on government officials. While things like fines or even jail time are theoretically possible for federal officials who are found in contempt, it's very rare for that to happen in practice.
And I'm guessing this protection, this sovereign immunity, also covers individuals working within the government too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The U.S. also recognizes something called qualified immunity. This protects government officials from being sued personally unless their actions clearly violate established legal or constitutional rights, and you have to prove that the officials knew about these rights when they did whatever they did. So there are a lot of legal protections for government actors in the U.S. system.
You mentioned a really fascinating historical example earlier, the case with Abraham Lincoln and John Merriman. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a great example, though a pretty extreme one that shows how complicated these things can be. So, during the Civil War, President Lincoln basically ignored a court order that had to do with the detention of this civilian, John Merriman, who was being held without charges. Lincoln acknowledged that the court had legal authority, but he argued that what he was doing was necessary to save the Union during this time of rebellion. And this situation really highlights the potential for clashes, and the tough decisions that have to be made when the executive branch asserts its power against a court ruling, particularly in extraordinary times. It shows us that even when the law seems clear, real-world situations, what people perceive as necessary actions, can sometimes lead to noncompliance. Ultimately, in more typical situations, U.S. judges tend to avoid direct confrontations with the executive and try to get compliance through less adversarial ways.
So there's a tendency for negotiation, for working things out rather than direct confrontation in the U.S.
Right.
What about India? How do Indian courts approach this issue of noncompliance and penalties?
Indian courts, they're a bit more direct. They have the power to impose fines, order people to jail, and they can even summon government officials to appear before them to explain why they haven't followed an order. On top of that, the Code of Civil Procedure, the CRPC, has specific rules for enforcing court decisions. These rules include things like seizing property and even arresting people who refuse to obey a court order.
Wow, that sounds a lot more forceful than what we see in the U.S. What about sovereign immunity in India? Does it offer the same level of protection as in the U.S.?
India does have the principle of sovereign immunity, and it's based on Article 300 of the Constitution. But it's not as strong as in the U.S. That means there are more ways for people and entities to sue the government in India. And importantly, government officials in India don't have that blanket immunity. They can be held personally responsible for their actions, particularly if they intentionally disobey a court order. So when you combine that with those strong contempt powers, you have a system where Indian courts arguably have a lot more leverage when it comes to getting the executive branch to follow their rulings.
That's a really important difference to understand. It seems like the Indian judiciary has both more authority in some areas and stronger ways to make sure their orders are followed. Let's talk about judicial review now. How does the role of the courts in reviewing actions taken by the executive branch differ between the two countries, and how does that play into this whole question of compliance?
In the U.S., the courts certainly have the power to interpret laws and decide whether they're constitutional or not. But in certain areas, they tend to give more leeway to the executive branch, making it harder to overturn actions taken by the president and their administration.
And what's it like in India?
Judicial review is much more powerful in India. The courts, especially the Supreme Court and the high courts, can strike down any law or executive action that they believe violates the Constitution. There are some landmark cases in India, like the Keshavanda Bharati case back in 1973. This case really solidified the idea of the basic structure of the Constitution. It basically means that even Parliament can't change the Constitution in ways that would fundamentally alter its core framework. This strong system of judicial review acts as a major check on both the legislature and the executive in India.
So bringing it back to this whole idea of executive accountability, it seems like having a strong system of judicial review in India adds another layer of protection, right? It makes sure the executive branch stays within its constitutional boundaries and follows the law, including court orders.
Exactly right. The fact that Indian courts can directly invalidate executive actions they find unconstitutional gives them a more direct and possibly more effective means of oversight. They have a stronger check on executive power compared to the U.S. system.
All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive, let's quickly go over some of the key differences we've talked about, especially for those of you out there getting ready for the UPSC exams.
Okay, so we've seen that the Indian Supreme Court generally has a wider scope of authority and that it's easier for the public to access thanks to things like public interest litigation. And there are some important differences in how contempt of court cases can get started in each country. But maybe the biggest takeaway is this. Indian courts seem to have more power to punish people who don't follow their orders, and sovereign immunity isn't as absolute in India as it is in the U.S. Plus, the well-established system of judicial review in India is a really important way to check the power of the executive branch.
And for all of our UPSC aspirants out there, getting a handle on these nuances is super important. This isn't just about comparing two different legal systems. It's about developing a deep, sophisticated understanding of the fundamental principles of how India is governed and how it compares to other big democracies around the world. Doing this kind of comparative analysis is incredibly valuable for both the prelims and the mains exams.
No doubt about it. It helps you think more critically and in a more informed way about governance and constitutional issues. It's not just about memorizing facts, it's about really understanding how things work in practice.
So here's one final thing for you to think about as you continue studying. We've seen how the courts in the U.S. and India have different powers and different ways to enforce their rulings. How do you think those differences affect the balance of power within each country's government? And how do they affect how effectively those governments can protect and enforce the rights of their citizens? Think about the strengths and weaknesses of each system when it comes to making sure everyone's accountable and that the rule of law is upheld.
That's a great question to consider. Really gets you thinking.
We hope this deep dive has been helpful as you prepare for your exams. If you found it useful, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below if you have any questions or thoughts about this really important topic. And just a reminder, we base this whole discussion on information and analysis from the Indian Express, so check out their reporting if you want to delve even deeper. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.